Welcome to DT Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. I'm DT Kane, author of the epic fantasy series The Aggersfar Saga and the spoken books Uprising. Each week, I read from one of my novels, discuss my writing process, answer your questions, and have general discussions about fantasy fiction. It's like a book club, except I do all the work for you. Find show notes, info about all my novels, and much more at dtkane.com. Here's the show. Chapter 11. "Don't be thick," Deliritous said to Rox, his voice rising as it often did when he was annoyed. "It's been 5 days and you've barely slept. How can you keep your oath if you're snoozing in the saddle when danger strikes?" "Danger is already here," Rox said. While his voice was still deep as a canyon, there was wariness in it. Somehow, that worried Baz. He'd always thought of Rox more like a massive tool rather than breathing flesh and blood. It was much easier to disdain a tool than it was a person. "Nonsense. Hellar's done nothing to suggest he'd break his bargain with me." "He is not the one I worry over," Rox replied. Deliritous shook his head. He'd removed his hat, and his yellow hair, unwashed from days of travel, shone in the firelight. "Marla won't move on us either. Kolnar Library wishes to curry favor with Xavier just as much as I do. She won't risk aggravating Hellar. Sleep, Rox. That's the end of it. I'll keep watch." Baz considered pointing out that just that morning, Marla had nearly shown Baz the color of his insides, but talking had gotten him in enough trouble for one day, and a night blessedly devoid of Rox's droning tunes was sufficient to convince him to just wrap Liana's cloak about him and forget his worries. Baz awoke in the middle of the night. Not uncommon, except this time it hadn't been an ill-positioned rock that had robbed him of sleep, but muttering in the darkness. Now, to an ordinary person, that might not seem a big deal. Maybe someone had risen to make water, or your bedmate's having a bad dream, or a companion is mumbling in his sleep. But when you have legitimate concerns about other readers wishing you serious harm, sinister murmurs coming from the darkness is no laughing matter. Baz rolled over in the voice's direction. There, he saw an outline illuminated by a candle. A traveling lectern hung from the figure's neck, supporting a spoken book at eye level. The candlelight reflected off the jeweled hilt of Marla's dagger. Retch was beside her, fidgeting as he repeated Marla's words, so softly Baz couldn't make them out. Whatever spell she was reading was a complex one. How long had Baz been awake? 30 seconds? More? A flash of fear washed over Baz as he briefly considered that Marla was reading a murder, a spell that simply stopped one's heart outright. But those were terribly complex and incredibly dangerous, as they utilized mostly the element of shadow, which nearly no one understood. They could also take an hour or more to read. Oh, and they were illegal. That was all foolish, however, since Marla's speaker was a creator. He wouldn't be capable of such a spell. Baz let his eyes search out Deliritous. He was a few paces away, back against the tree under which they'd set up their camp. He was asleep. That irresponsible little... Wait, no, not asleep. His eyes were still open, but glazed over as if in a trance. The light of another candle glinted off the pearly buttons of Hellar's tunic. He was reading from a book of his own to Trunnel, so Deliritous hadn't been derelict in his duties. Likely, Hellar had come over pretending he wanted to talk, then caught Deliritous in a web of influence. Cold terror grasped Baz. If Hellar was focused on Deliritous, did that mean Marla was? But no, Her speaker wasn't even looking in Baz's direction, which meant he must be... "Rocks, wake up!" Baz shouted. The Harbour had appeared to be fast asleep on his back, razor rising and falling with his chest. But almost before the words were out of Baz's mouth, Rox was already up on his feet, razor extended. He lashed out at the first thing he saw, which unfortunately was Trunnel rather than Retch. Trunnel cried out as the straight edge of Rox's weapon slashed across his thigh. If he'd been inches closer, it would have taken off his leg. As it was, blood still sprayed into the air, and he fell back, coughing as the spell he'd been speaking died in his mouth. Too late, Rox realized Retch and Marla were also present. Just as he turned in Marla's direction, she stopped speaking, and an instant later the ground about Rox erupted, as roots as wide around as tree trunks began wrapping themselves about his limbs. The Harbour strained against them, and for an instant Baz thought he might actually break free. Apparently so did Retch, who squawked and fell backward as he tried to flinch away. But the roots continued to roll out of the ground until Rox's entire body was nearly covered in them. His eyes burned like those of a trapped animal, but he was bound so tightly he couldn't even turn his head, much less wriggle to escape. Baz knew when it was time to get out. While everyone was still collecting themselves from the flurry of action, he crawled away to the tree line of the copse in which they'd camped. He got himself behind the largest tree he could find and leaned against it. His panting breaths sounded like a beast's roars, the night air sharp as an icicle as he gulped it down. "I knew your Harbour ought to have taken care of Torchsire's speaker," Hellar said. He was crouched over Trunnel, and for the first time since they'd left erstwhile, Baz heard actual emotion in his voice. "Get your speaker over here and heal him before he bleeds out." Marla snorted, glancing around the clearing. "You could just as easily have sent yours after him, and leave myself unguarded while I spoke to my influencer?" In any other circumstance, Baz wouldn't have been able to contain a snort of derision. Even now, out in the wilds and in the midst of turning on one of their fellow readers, they couldn't trust their speakers long enough to ensure a loose end like Baz didn't interfere with their plans. "Marla!" snapped Hellar. "He needs healing. Now." Baz chanced to look around the tree trunk. For several moments, it appeared as if Marla intended to let Trunnel die, but then her eyes darted to Arrow, Hellar's Harbour. She must not have liked the way he was fingering his bow, and her own Harbour wasn't close enough to stop him from putting an arrow through her eye. "No problem, Hellar," she said, her voice taking on the same chilling, sing-song pleasantness it had when she'd threatened Baz earlier. She removed a book from the pack on her Harbour's back, opened it, and began reading to Retch, who repeated the words. A handful of seconds later, a mist of white particles floated from Retch's fingertips into Trunnel's leg. He immediately stopped squirming and breathed a sigh of relief. "There, will that do?" Marla cooed. Hellar shook his head, expression suggesting that he couldn't believe he'd stooped to the level of cooperating with someone as mad as Marla clearly was. Deliritous chose that moment to regain consciousness. "Whoa, what?" His voice was still slurred from whatever spell Hellar had used, sounding like a drunk just thrown out of the tavern. "Well," Marla said, the sudden spike of interest in her voice sending a shiver down Baz's spine. "Welcome to our little get-together, Torchsire. Ryle, hold him." Marla's Harbour strode over to Deliritous, slipped the book pack off her shoulders, and dropped it to the ground beside Deliritous. The sound seemed to bring him fully awake. He blinked several times, then sat up and looked around, a hesitant smile touching his lips. "Oh, Hello there, chaps. What time is it? A bit early for... Hey, what are you... Ah! Deliritus's good-natured drawling cut off into a gurgled cry as Ryle lifted him off the ground by his throat. His boot soles scuffed the ground, kicking up little stones. His hat toppled off, feather floating to the ground. Ryle trampled it as she shifted her weight to keep a grip on Deliritus's squirming form. "Marla, is this drama really necessary?" Hellar said. Now that Trunnel was healed, he seemed to have lost all interest in him, his voice returning to its typical disinterested drone. He was rummaging around in his own book pack, which was still on Arrow's back. Marla ignored Hellar. "Ryle, be a dear and put Deliritus down for a moment. I think he's trying to tell us something." The Harbour complied, but didn't release her grasp on the front of Deliritus's shirt. Deliritous took a few deep breaths, then started and stopped speaking several times before taking another deep breath and putting his shoulders back. "I see you've decided to take the dishonorable path after all. Personally, I'd a higher opinion of the two of you, but it seems I should have listened to Baztian." "Baztian?" Marla asked. "His speaker," Hellar said, still rummaging around in the book pack and sounding bored, as if he were being kept from something important. "Oh, right," Marla said, voice playful and feral. "You actually call them by name, like little pets. It's cute, I suppose." Deliritus glared at her, then began looking around. "Where is he? Baztian! Baztian?" Baz grimaced from his hiding spot. Deliritus actually sounded concerned. He was probably just worried over what it would mean for his chances of winning the trials if he lost his speaker. Still, Baz's hands tightened around the trunk of the tree as Deliritus continued to shout for him. Deliritus's eyes returned to Marla. "You didn't." His words trailed off, as if he feared to complete the sentence. "Don't be so dramatic," Marla said, mock offense in her tone. "We've done nothing to him. Yet. Hellar, why don't you send your Harbour off to have some fun with Torchsire's pet?" Deliritus struggled against Ryle's grip, but he might as well have been trying to bend steel for all the good it did him. Hellar paused his searching in the book pack for a moment, sparing a glance for Marla. "You and I have very different ideas of fun," he said. "Besides, his speaker's useless without Torchsire to read to him. I won't send my Harbour off on a needless search. Let the wilds have him." No," Marla said. "That won't do. I've a thing or two I need to show that boy after our exchange from earlier." Baz shuddered and put his back to the tree trunk once more. He'd be finished in a heartbeat if either one of them sent a Harbour looking for him. He had few talents, and none of them involved running farther than the distance from his sleeping pallet to the privy back in Torchsire Library. "I suppose I ought to be honored," Deliritous said, temporarily drawing Marla's attention away from tracking down Baz. "The two of you thought me enough of a threat to gang up on me." Marla threw her head back and laughed. The sound was so saturated with madness that Baz covered his ears. His hands were shaking. "Hardly, dearie, hardly. It was that which concerned us." She jabbed a finger at rocks. He'd stopped struggling against the roots that encased him like a sarcophagus, though his eyes were clear in the moon's glow, tracking Marla's every movement. Deliritus followed the direction of Marla's finger, his mouth retreating to a thin line. "What do you intend?" he asked. You can't kill me. The rules forbid it, and my father would hunt you down." The gravity of Deliritus's threat was seriously hampered by the cracking of his voice, but he did manage to keep a level glare at Marla. You going to be a party to this too, Hellar? The Torchsire heir asked without taking his eyes from Marla. I thought we had a deal. You need Torchsire's support. Before Hellar could respond, Marla slapped Deliritous across the face. Don't be daft, dearie. Her tone of voice was like that of a parent correcting a child. The stark contrast between that and her having just struck Deliritous was chilling. It's not you we need dead. You're no threat at all. That, on the other hand, she pointed at Rox once more. Hellar, would you mind? You're the one who is so eager to be moving on, after all. Hellar glanced at Rox, then to Marla, and sighed. Fine. His tone was resigned, as if he was being asked to perform a chore he disliked. Arrow, kill the Torchsire Harbour, and don't give me any lectures. He's a threat to me, and you know it. Arrow glanced back to Hellar for a moment, then nodded. The words mean what they mean. It sounded so very odd to Baz, those words coming not in Rox's rumbling basso, but from the sweet tenor of Arrow's much higher voice. Wait, Deliritous said, beginning once more to struggle against Ryle's grip. This isn't necessary. We'll just back out of the trials. Yes, how about that? Marla tapped a finger to her lips for a moment, then shook her head. No, that would never do. Even if you kept that oath and just limped back to erstwhile, there's no telling what you might try to do to us in the future. Better to kill the brute now. You spineless book-burner, Deliritous cried. Face me in a duel, why don't you? Show some scrap of honor, you motherless... Marla raised a booted foot and stomped it down on Deliritus's lower leg. Deliritus's curses were cut short by the audible cracking of bone and then the cries of agony that erupted from his lips. Poor form, Torchsire, Marla said, all traces of frivolity gone from her tone. Speaking of one's mother... Baz's innards clenched at the sounds of Deliritus's suffering. This was bad. They'd kill Rox, then they'd go looking for him as well. Maybe they couldn't kill Deliritous outright, but they could leave him with a broken leg out in the wilds with no supplies. Fear gripped Baz, and he almost began to sprint away from the clearing as fast as he could. But Baz was surprised to find another emotion mixed with the fear. Anger. Anger at Marla's casual cruelty, at Hellar's detached indifference, and most of all, anger at how ill-equipped Deliritous was to deal with them. Not because he was entirely inept, though he'd plenty ineptitude in him, but because he lacked the deplorable characteristics of Marla and Hellar. He wasn't despicable enough to concoct a plan like what Marla and Hellar had hatched, nor hard enough to carry it out with the apathy Hellar demonstrated. He was still the ink-spilling bastard who had ruined Tax's life, but... Scribes curse me for a fool, Baz muttered as he left the safety of the tree trunk to crawl through the underbrush at the clearing's edge. There was one thing he could do to perhaps save Deliritous, and Rox too, he supposed. If they were going to survive after tonight, they'd need Rox's brute force as much as anything. But the plan was completely cracked. Even if it worked, he'd still probably be killed for it. By that time, Arrow had reached Rox, but he was making a show of selecting the proper knife from the bandolier of weapons strung across his chest. Marla was drinking in the sinister display, of course, every now and again aiming a kick at Deliritus's ribs when his moans rose above the volume of a whimper. Baz was at the point of no return. To get any closer to Deliritous, he'd need to leave the meager cover of the weeds in which he now hid. He froze for an instant, but another kick from Marla into Deliritus's midsection spurred him to action. He scurried out into the open, crouching low, not toward Deliritous, but to his book pack, which rested just behind the writhing Torchsire heir. By some stroke of luck, everyone had their backs to it, and Baz reached it without anyone noticing. All eyes were turned to Arrow, who'd finally selected a knife and was running it over a rough strip of hide, ensuring its sharpness. Rox's eyes followed the knife as it whisked back and forth. Baz had to give the giant some credit. He didn't look the least bit frightened, staring his own death in the face. Baz eased the book pack open and selected a volume at random. He glanced at the cover and nearly dropped it. The book he held was the same shadow tome he'd criticized Deliritous for even considering back at the library. What had Deliritous been thinking packing it? It'd been 10 years since Baz had attempted any serious reading, and books that called on the power of shadow were dangerous even to the most adept of speakers. He was just as likely to kill himself as hurt anyone else with it. But there was no time to think on that now, no time to search for a different book. Rox was seconds away from death. Baz opened the tome to a random page, then began thumbing through it, looking for anything that looked even vaguely familiar. Destruction was a harsh language to begin with, but the characters in this book looked even angrier than what Baz remembered, their sharp edges and hard consonants poking at Baz's eyes like Arrow's knives as he scanned the vellum for something familiar. Finally, he found a page with a stop rune he recognized and words he thought had something to do with fire. The spell was longer than he'd like, nearly a page in length, but he didn't have time to search further. Besides, a spell that long had to pack some punch. Baz glanced over to Arrow. He was putting the sharpening hide away. Not much time. He began to look back down to the page when he noticed Deliritous. His eyes were open, a mixture of pain and questions, staring right at Baz. Bloody burning books. This would have been hard enough to explain if Deliritous didn't see. Now, it didn't matter. He'd be dead anyway as soon as Marla recalled that he was out there and she sent one of the Harbors after him. Baz met Deliritus's eyes, put a finger to his lips, then looked down to the page, not waiting to see Deliritus's reaction. Baz uttered the stop rune, then began the spell, kneeling there on the ground with the book propped on his knees. Immediately he knew this wasn't going to end well. As soon as the first few words were out of his mouth, an alkaline bitterness began to coat his tongue, a smell like rotten eggs filling his nostrils. He prayed to the scribes no one else could smell it and barreled on, looking up every so often to ensure the image of Arrow remained fixed in his mind's eye. His diction was terrible, worse even than when Tax had first begun teaching him. But even with his relative disuse by Deliritous over the years, Baz had spoken thousands of spells since he'd been that young boy struggling to light a candle. And there were Tax's songs, too, the ones he taught to the other retirees and to which Baz so often listened. The one he'd heard when he'd visited Tax before leaving had been one of creation, but there were destruction songs, too, fevered, pulsing chants. Baz never joined in the singing, probably couldn't repeat a single verse from memory. But it was as Tax said, the words were important, but they weren't the only thing. Baz stumbled on through the reading, feeling a burning at the back of his throat every time he mispronounced a syllable. But each time he shaped the next word just so, making up for the misstep, keeping the spell from faltering. It would likely hurt to swallow for a week by the time he was through, but at least his lungs wouldn't be burning from the inside out. As he neared the spell's conclusion, he began to hear another voice. For a moment he thought Hellar had noticed him and was directing Trunnel to cast a spell on him. but the voice wasn't coming from another person. Rather, it was inside his own head. And it wasn't one voice, but many, each terrible in its own way, imploring him to do awful things. What was happening? Baz's eyes darted over the last few words. Then he looked up, staring intently at Arrow and pointing a hand at him. He pushed the phantom voices from his mind and completed uttering the words without looking back down at the page. The last word left his lips and something erupted from his fingertips. It looked like fire, but it was tinged of violet and didn't seem to have any heat in it. If anything, it raised chilling prickles on Baz's skin as it rushed from his hand in a gout. It was poorly aimed, likely a result of his awful pronunciation. It was so wild that a portion of the powerful spray nearly took out rocks, instead hitting a portion of the roots that bound him, dissolving them to nothing. But enough of the spell found its intended mark. One moment, Arrow was standing there before rocks, knife raised. The next, the spell hit him, and he was just gone. Body evaporated into a fine mist. Most of it, anyway. Portions of his legs remained, falling to the ground with a hollow sound. Horrified, Baz tossed the book away and scrabbled back. Arrow certainly hadn't been a nice person, and the way he'd been looking at rocks as he sharpened his knife suggested that Baz had done Oration a great favor removing him from existence. But it was still a shock for Baz to realize that he'd merely spoken some words, and now the world held one less life. Was anyone truly fit to wield such power? And those voices, what had caused those? "What in the name of the scribes?" Hellar cried. "Arrow? Arrow?" "Don't be an idiot, Hellar," Marla hissed. She was crouched down, looking all about her. Baz lay prone on the ground, trying not to move, or even breathe. "Your Harbour is dead. The spell came from—" "It wasn't a spell," cried Deliritous. For an instant, Baz thought the fool actually meant to reveal what he'd done to the other readers. That would be just like him, ungrateful little— "It was a dragon," Deliritous said, voice full of fear. Either he'd suddenly discovered a penchant for acting, or he really was frightened. And it wasn't the fictional dragon out in the darkness that he was scared of. "I saw it, over there." Deliritous pointed in a direction the spell could plausibly have come from, though not directly at Baz. "A dragon?" Hellar said. He sounded dazed, as if he still couldn't believe his Harbour had just been vaporized before his eyes. Baz couldn't blame him. He'd been the one to cast the spell, and he was still coming to grips with it. This close to erstwhile? That's impossible. "Impossible?" Marla sneered. "What else could it be? A shadow breather, judging by the fire that just took out your Harbour. Explains why we can't see it. They phase between our reality and the elsewhere beyond. The Dark One's work," she muttered, eyes darting over the murk beyond the clearing. "We need to go, now. Ryle, grab the books." Marla's Harbour rushed in Baz's direction, but stopped short of him, stooping down to retrieve the book pack she'd dropped near Deliritous. "You can either stand here gawking, Hellar, or come with us. No skin off my knuckles either way." Hellar stared numbly at Arrow's remains for another moment, then cursed under his breath. He replaced the books he'd removed from his pack, then hurried after Marla, Trunnel limping alongside him. Neither reader gave Deliritous even a backward glance as they abandoned him. Baz remained still, staring up at the star-filled sky for several minutes before he even dared to start breathing again. Eventually, he built up enough courage to stand and look around. Deliritous had managed to crawl over to rocks and was futilely pulling at the roots that still held the Harbour fast to the ground. When Deliritous saw Baz, he squawked and held a shaking finger out toward him. You stay away from me, you cuss! Stay away, you hear? You have got to be kidding me, Baz thought. Chapter 12. Baz just stood there, maybe 10 paces away from Deliritous, hands on his hips. Deliritous was still trying to crawl farther away from him, though he was already backed up against the mass of roots holding rocks in place. His broken leg was stretched out in front of him. There wasn't any blood, and it still seemed straight enough, but Deliritus's face was pale, and between horrified stares in Baz's direction, he whimpered with discomfort. "It's illegal, Baztian," Deliritus said. He'd put on what Baz assumed he thought was a brave face, though the shaking in his hands and voice completely ruined any semblance of courage Deliritous might have otherwise projected. "You can't read. How is that even possible?" Deliritous appeared to think that over for a moment, then his eyes widened. "Yeltax, he did teach you." Baz glowered and began to step closer to Deliritous. Again, the Torchsire heir tried to back away without success. So instead, his mouth began spewing whatever it could think of, voice growing higher by the second. "I always thought because you were so young that he couldn't have... Well, it doesn't matter. The harm is done. The only thing to do is bring you back and tell Father. He'll be furious, of course, both over my losing the trials and having to retire another speaker. But what's there to do? I'll try to convince him you ought to just be blinded like your brother, but I don't..." Baz backhanded Deliritous across the face with such force he sprawled to one side, letting out a cry of pain, though that was probably due more to the jarring position of his broken leg rather than Baz's meager strength. Rox growled from within his prison of detritus. "Don't you start," Baz said, stabbing a finger at Rox's face, nearly poking him in the eye. "You'd be dead if I hadn't just put my neck on the headsman's block." Somewhere in the back of his mind, Baz realized he was screaming at the most dangerous man he'd ever met, but the risk of doing so hardly registered over the anger that had bubbled over within him. A decade of repressed frustration and rage at Deliritous, at Rox, at the whole bloody society of erstwhile, of all of oration. Rox's eyebrows rose up the plane of his hairless head, but he made no further sound. "And you," Baz turned his pointing finger on Deliritous. The finger might as well have been one of Arrow's daggers, the way Deliritous flinched away from it. "Let's start this conversation over. How about a thank you?" Thank you? What in the name of the scribes for?" Baz took a step toward Deliritous and raised his hand once more. Deliritous threw his arms before his face, cowering. "No, please. I never hit you." Baz already had his mouth open to snarl a curse at Deliritous for being so ungrateful, but Deliritus's words struck him harder than any blow Rox could have managed. Baz's arm dropped, and his legs suddenly grew wobbly, fear replacing the rush of adrenaline that had been consuming him. He sunk to the ground until he was sitting face to face with Deliritous. Gain an ounce of power, and look what his first inclination had been. Treat Deliritous just like most readers treated their speakers. "Sorry, Deliritous," Baz mumbled. "Shouldn't have hit you. But I did just stop Hellar and Marla from leaving you alone in the wilds with a broken leg in a dead harbor. Well, that doesn't cancel out the fact that..." "Truth!" Rox rumbled, making Deliritous jump and grimace in pain as his leg twisted. "For the love of mothers, Rox, don't startle me like that. Can't you see the state I'm in? And what do you mean, truth?" "Baztian, he speaks truth." Deliritous looked at Rox slack-jawed for several moments before recovering. "Well, yes, I suppose he did me a bit of a service, but the way he did it... And even if I could pretend I didn't see what he did, there's the business of my leg here. We can't go on." Baz rubbed at the bridge of his nose. "Let me ask you, Deliritous," he said, continuing to rub at his face and not looking at Deliritous. "How, exactly, do you intend to get me to return to Erstwhile with you to have my eyes put out?" "What do you mean? You'll just come. You're a speaker. I'm a reader. You do what I say." Baz shook his head. "Deliritous, look. Rox is held fast by those roots, and you can't stand, much less walk. Let's think this through. Do you really think I'm going to help you free Rox and walk all the way back to Erstwhile, knowing what you intend when we get there?" But you must listen. Baztian, look, I don't much like the business. I still have nightmares about that day with your brother. Don't you for a moment act like you have a right to be upset over what you did to Tax," Baz said, some of the heat returning to his voice. Deliritous half raised his hands in front of his face, as if he feared Baz might try to strike him again. When he saw Baz making no move to do so, he lowered them tentatively, saying, "Well, it's the truth, but—" He held up a hand to forestall another outburst from Baz. "I shan't speak of him any more, but what would you have me do?" Now, there was the first sensible thing Deliritous had said this entire time, though Baz doubted he realized it. But a broken clock and all that. They sat there in silence for several minutes. Deliritous seemed to be sulking, giving an occasional whimper of pain. Rox was studying Baz, making him squirm. He tried to ignore it. What were they to do? Deliritous had spent his entire life learning it was a mortal sin for someone like Baz to read. He wouldn't let it go, and Baz wasn't going to just walk back to Erstwhile to face the same fate as his brother. But neither was he going to take the route some in his position might, namely cutting Deliritus's helpless throat and make a run for it. Part of him actually thought that would be the sensible thing to do. Scribes knew he'd fantasized often enough of Deliritous getting what he deserved for ruining Tax's life. But every time his mind tried to go there, he remembered what Tax would always say about Deliritous, that he was just a product of his environment. Killing Deliritous for fearing a speaker who could read wouldn't be much different from killing a cow for chewing cud. It's just what they did. And then there was Tax himself. If he murdered Deliritous here and left Rox to rot, there'd be no way he could ever return to Erstwhile. He'd never see his brother again, and Tax would never know what had happened to him. Baz's insides twisted at the thought of his brother, alone in the dark, never hearing from him again. Something Liana had said to him before they departed suddenly came to mind, about how much pressure the Duke was putting on Deliritous. Baz's stomach contorted further at the idea that began to form in his mind. "Deliritous," he said, "how important are the trials to you?" Deliritus's face twisted as if he thought Baz was mocking him. "How important? Come now, Baztian. I know you aren't involved with Erstwhilian politics, but you must see that Torchsire isn't as well, regarded as it once was. The library needs the boost my win in the trials would give it, and my father wants that more than anything." Deliritus's face paled even further than the snapping of his leg had caused it to. "But my leg, it just won't be in the cards now." Deliritus's lower lip began to tremble, and he looked away from Baz, who cursed under his breath. Whether the curse was for having made Deliritous cry, or for what he was about to suggest, he wasn't certain. How had he gotten into this mess? "What if," Baz said, speaking slowly, as he knew each word was vital now, What if I told you there was another deck of cards we could use? Another deck of... What are you talking about? Baz shut his eyes and let out a long breath. What if I traveled to Tome? What if I finished the trials for you? Hello, welcome back to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Today is March 19th, 2022. Jeez, you'd think 3 months in I could write the correct year at this point. March 19th, 2022, as I record this, and this is episode 10. They say something like half of all podcasts don't make it past episode 10, so here we are, bucking the trend here, plowing away. And they also say 10% of all statistics are made up, so take that for what it's worth. All right, quick personal update, then we will jump into quite an exciting chapters 11 and 12 here. At least I hope you found them exciting. You're probably not still with us, I would say, if you didn't find these chapters at least somewhat exciting. So, well, if for those of you who who follow the newsletter, a bit of a tougher week for me here. Came back from vacation last week to some water damage in the house. Kind of started on the second floor and made its way down to the first floor. So ripped out a bunch of walls this week. Had the fine contractors from ServPro over here going in and out. So wife and I have been sleeping in an air mattress in here. Actually, that's why you'll probably notice that my usual accoutrements here behind me are missing. This is actually an attic here behind me where my shirt's hanging up right now, and we have the air mattress in there right now, pulling it in and out every night. So dealing with that, fun times. But it's going okay, and looks like home insurance is going to come through for us, so that's good, at least. And thankfully, still got my writing, so I actually started on part 4 of the Spoken Books Uprising this week, working on the first draft. Got about 7,500 words done on that, though I've needed to back burner that for a few days because I just got my editor's edits back on part 2, which is coming out in less than a month now, April 15th, the Declaimer's Discovery, part 2 of the Spoken Books Uprising. So I'm working on addressing those edits and getting the formatting finalized so I can send copies out to my advanced readers here soon. So that's what's going on in D.T. Kane's writing world. Like I said, part 2 is out April 15th, and you can pre-order your copy now if you would like. Link for that is down in the show notes. Excuse me. All right. With that said, let's get into chapters 11 and 12 here. Hope you enjoyed these as much as I enjoyed writing them. I think lots of tension here and kind of a few monumental moments for the whole rest of the book here. So let's get started. I kind of liked what I did last week, kind of naming the different sections of the discussion, so I'm going to do that again. So this first section is Mutters in the Night. So we start with Deliritous insisting that Rox get some sleep rather than keeping watch. Rox is obviously wary of that, right? Marla in particular, Deliritous says something like, well, Hellar is holding up his end of the bargain so far, and Rox is like, well, he's not the one I'm worried about. So, but Rox has been keeping watch every night, so he must be exhausted, and Baz notices how tired he looks, and that actually worries him. Baz says here, he'd always thought of Rox more like a massive tool rather than breathing flesh and blood. It was much easier to disdain a tool than it was a person. This is I think this is a theme throughout the novel. Obviously, Baz does not really like Deliritous or Rox, but it's tough to go on hating someone when you've spent time with them under difficult circumstances. And certainly already Baz's opinion of Deliritous and Roxter is being challenged a little. And that's going to continue on here. But I doubt it came as too much of a surprise to anyone that having Deliritous keep watch instead of Rox didn't end up working out, right? Obviously, we were foreshadowing something here. Baz wakes to muttering in the darkness. And as he notes, that might not be an alarm or a cause for alarm for ordinary folks, but when you're worried about readers wishing you harm, it's kind of the last thing you want to hear. So Marla and Hellar have obviously kind of been plotting behind Deliritus's back because this attack was coordinated. I guess it's unclear whether Marla and Hellar had this planned all along, or if Hellar was initially intending to see if the truce Deliritous had proposed could work, and then decided against it after that scene with Marla and Baz at the end of Chapter 10. I don't think I ever really make that entirely clear. I don't think it really matters to the understanding of the story. Though obviously based on how they were kind of conversing with each other right after they left Erstwhile, and the cryptic looks, we've seen them give each other a few times. Obviously there's something going on between them that probably extends past just the past few days that everyone's been together here at the start of the trials. Right, so let's just set the scene here a little. Marla is reading this spell to her creator, the creator speaker, and that results in roots shooting out of the ground to imprison rocks. And at the same time, Hellar's using his influencer to lull Deliritous into a stupor so he can't raise the alarm. So immediately we see, one of Hellar's plans with bringing a influencer along instead of the more common choices of a creator or a destroyer. If he can lull his competitors into a false sense of security and then capitalize on that, you can see how that's an advantage, and that's what he does here. So the two of them are, busy with their enchantments on Rox and Deliritous, and they kind of leave Baz off to the side. He's laying down, kind of not in the direct proximity of Deliritous or Rox. Which, I guess that makes sense, right? Baz obviously isn't buddy-buddy with the pair of them, so he's sleeping a little ways away from them. So he's not in, the immediate line of fire. But we do kind of see Marla's and Hellar's hubris. It's a bit of their undoing, I guess, here, though they never really fully realize it. They left Baz unaccounted for because neither of them wanted to be without their Harbour, right, while they were reading to their speakers. Remember, kind of all the way back to chapter 2, that's, obviously Harbours in general protect their readers, but one thing they do specifically is when the reader is reading a spell aloud to their speaker, the Harbour kind of keeps an eye on the speaker to make sure the speaker doesn't try to turn the spell on their reader. So, each of Marla and Hellar are like, oh, well, you should have sent your Harbour after the Torchsire speaker. But they're like, well, geez, I wasn't going to be without my Harbour while I was reading, And what's Baz's comment here? He addresses this directly. Even now, out in the wilds and in the midst of turning on one of their fellow readers, they couldn't trust their speakers long enough to ensure a loose end like Baz didn't interfere with their plans. So this is obviously a weakness here of the readers, and Baz exploits it, and something to keep in mind for the future as well. Hellar and Marla kind of assume that Baz is essentially useless if Deliritous can't read to him, and as we're about to see, that costs them here, right? All right, so moving on to the next section of our discussion here, titled, "Oh, hello there, chaps." So Baz shouts the warning to Rox, right? But he's a little too late. Rox is caught by the roots. Though he does manage to injure Trunnel, right? Hellar's influencer, before he's confined. And we see that maybe this relationship between Hellar and Marla isn't, this one's not really a smooth relationship either. Hellar demands that Marla heal his speaker, but it seems like she's going to refuse until she notices that Hellar's Harbour has a clear shot at her with his bow. Marla is Marla's in it to win it, so to speak. She could have potentially greatly handicapped both of her opponents here, right? Dispose of rocks, let Trunnel bleed out, so both of her competitors are down a person on their teams, and it certainly raises questions about whether even Hellar is wise in trusting her. Obviously, Deliritous' trust was misplaced here, but Hellar, maybe he's not making such a great decision here either. Let me know. What do you guys think? Where is this relationship between Hellar and Marla gonna end up? Shoot me an email. Would love to see if any of you can give me some accurate predictions. As always, dtkane@dtkane.com. Right, so during the confusion of Rox injuring Trunnel and nearly escaping the roots, Baz runs and hides behind a tree. So now he's watching this scene kind of from afar. I guess it's kind of interesting he doesn't run away completely, right? I mean, everyone's lost track of him, and I guess he comes up with some justifications for why he doesn't run away. Maybe they're good ones, he's like, I couldn't survive out in the wilds alone, and maybe the more important one is he figures he'll never be able to see his brother again if he runs away. Obviously, if the readers back in erstwhile realized that Baz abandoned his reader, then they wouldn't keep him around for very long. Of course, Baz in his characteristic way also justifies it by he's not a very good runner, right? He had few talents, and none of them involved running farther than the distance from his sleeping pallet to the privy back in Torchsire Library. But still, he's got all these reasons, but you get the sense there's something more, right? So let's hold on to that for a minute. We'll come back to that. But, at this point, Deliritous wakes up from the spell. Hellar's put him under, and, he showed some savvy in the previous chapter, right? Kind of negotiating this, rocky truce. But, we still see his innocence, or maybe you would call it naivete here. He initially doesn't even think anything's amiss. Oh, hello there, chaps. First thing he says when he wakes up. Of course, he is quickly debased of that when Marla's Harbour grabs him by the throat and lifts him off the ground. Even Deliritous can't miss that they've betrayed him at that point. And then Deliritous looks around and realizes Baz is gone and starts shouting for him, almost like he is concerned, fearing that Marla has killed Baz. And Baz actually feels kind of bad, right? Listening to the concern in Deliritous' voice, and Baz doesn't really know what to make of that. Again, Deliritous isn't supposed to like Baz, and it's hard to hate someone if they have concern about you, right? Baz's beliefs constantly being challenged here the further and further we get into the book. And speaking of fear, our fears about Marla obviously totally warranted, right? She's kind of just toying with Deliritous, telling him, we didn't do this because of you, Deliritous. We wanted to eliminate your giant bodyguard. We found he was the biggest threat out here. Don't be daft, dearie. She tells him when Deliritous suggests, oh well, I guess I should be flattered that you saw me as enough of a threat to to attack me. That's not the case, Deliritous. All right. You spineless book burner. That's our next section here. So things go from bad to worse. Marla asks Hellar to have his Harbour kill Rox, which Hellar does. And Deliritous, frantically, he tries to bargain here. I'll forfeit the trials. I'll just go back to erstwhile. You don't got to kill Rox, right? And obviously, I think we kind of established this already, but this obviously shows Deliritous' feelings for Rox, right? Because we've seen how important it is for him to do well in these trials between all the pressure his father's putting on him and his resistance to his uncle's earlier suggestion that Deliritous kind of just hide and keep yourself alive, right? And then, actually, in the next chapter, in chapter 12, which we also read today, again, Baz kind of point blank asks Deliritous how important the trials are to him, and he makes it clear that winning them is very important, but he is willing to forfeit if it means keeping Rox alive. But obviously, that doesn't sate Marla. Well, even if we don't kill him now, maybe you'll have him do something to us back in Erstwhile once we all get back. So let's just dispose of him. So Deliritous gets angry then, right? Starts cursing at Marla, says something about her mother, and that was apparently that's the line you cross with Marla, right? She stomps down on his leg and breaks it. So now Deliritous is, his situation is from bad to worse. His Harbour is captured, his speaker is missing, and now he's got a broken leg. He's kind of out in the middle of nowhere, so not looking good here. And this kind of is all building up to the point, Baz is hiding behind the tree the whole time, kind of just watching this unfold, and, this is Baz's moment, right? Probably the most pivotal moment in the whole book. We wouldn't really, there would be no more story but for the decision Baz is about to make here. And remember, I told you Baz was going to make a big decision last week, and here it is. But but first, remember I noted just a few minutes ago, Baz is like, well, I can't survive in the wilds, and I'll never see my brother again. So that's why I'm not running away. But but now we get a kind of maybe a real or a look at the real justification here. Just gonna read this excerpt here. Really kind of an inside look at how Baz is feeling. But Baz was surprised to find another emotion mixed with the fear. Anger. Anger at Marla's casual cruelty, at Hellar's detached indifference, and most of all, anger at how ill-equipped Deliritous was to deal with them. Not because he was entirely inept, though he'd plenty ineptitude in him, but because he lacked the deplorable characteristics of Marla and Hellar. He wasn't despicable enough to concoct a plan like what Hellar and Marla had hatched, nor hard enough to carry it out with the apathy Hellar demonstrated. He was still the ink-spilling bastard who had ruined Tax's life, but, so as we've seen several times, Baz's innate sense of right is shining through here again. He sees, he definitely is at least acknowledging that there are readers who are far worse than Deliritous, and, maybe Deliritous is not the scourge of society Baz really wants him to be. And he decides to save him for the second time in the first 11 chapters here. And, well, how is he going to save him? Baz just told us he doesn't have very many talents. Well, I'd bet most of you saw this coming, how he's going to do this, but he's going to read, right? He does remember back from when his brother taught him, we finally see, or at least, that's partially it, right? Partially from his brother teaching him. Baz does tell us he hasn't tried to read in 10 years, but, he's still able to read this very complex spell that he uses to save Deliritous. And we get two explanations here. One is, even if Deliritous doesn't utilize him often, it's been 10 years, so, especially in a library like Torchsire that doesn't have many speakers, Baz has been used. So he has spoken thousands of spells over the past decade, so it's not as if he hasn't had any practice repeating words that Deliritous has read to him aloud. But, then this second one, this is probably the more interesting one, right? Baz mentions Tax's songs. Remember, we heard back towards the end of part 2, what was that, chapter 7 or 8, I think. We heard Tax leading the other retirees in that song, and that song was in one of the languages of the Trinity, and Baz kind of suggests, those have had some innate effect on him. They've helped teach him just by listening to them over and over. And Baz, he doesn't know anything definitive here, but, perhaps there's more to Tax's songs than just passing the time, right? Is this a scheme that Tax thought up, to keep teaching Baz with these songs? Interesting. And this certainly isn't the final time we're going to kind of see the importance of singing words of the Trinity here, so keep that on your back burner and don't lose sight of it either. All right, our next section here is simply called Shadow. So Baz sneaks back into the camp. We've got Arrow, who is Hellar's Harbour. He's kind of taking his time here selecting. He's got this bandolier of weapons across his chest, right? So he selects the perfect knife, and he's sharpening it on the piece of hide here, taking his time, waiting to execute Rock. So Baz sneaks in, grabs a book from Deliritous' book pack, nearly drops it, right? Not because he's clumsy, right? But it's that crazy book of shadow spells, and we'll remember when Deliritous was trying to get Baz to participate in selecting the books they were going to take. At one point, Deliritous kind of hesitantly picked up this one book, and Baz was like, put that away before you hurt yourself. It's the same book. And we haven't gotten too much into this, but there are these 5 magical elements. So there's the 3 languages of the Trinity, which draw on one or more of the 5 elements in our world. The inks contain the powers of the elements, and the 5 are fire, earth, water, light, and shadow. And apparently, shadow isn't very well understood, and Baz tells us it's dangerous even for adept readers. So, and obviously Baz does not consider Deliritous an adept reader. So, why did he bring this book? But, Baz also, he is frantic, but Rox is moments away from being killed, so he just has to go with it. So he starts reading, and we see kind of a few things here right off the bat that kind of solidify Baz's statement here about Shadow being dangerous. First is Baz nears completion of the spell, so he's got the book kind of propped open. He's reading it, aiming it mentally in the direction of Arrow. He starts hearing voices in his head, though, right? Terrible voices imploring him to do awful things. You guys know that's going to be relevant later. I was like, oh, we'll have him hear some voices, and that'll never come up again. No, that's going to be relevant later here. But right now, neither us nor Baz have time to dwell on that. We are in the middle of an intense situation here. Second, Baz gets the spell off, right? He's like, well, my diction was terrible, but he manages to, it's like he course corrects while he's reading. He mispronounces one, but then he shapes the next syllable just right to keep the spell on track. And once he completes it, we see how vicious this spell ends up being, right? He, vaporizes Hellar's Harbour. Phasers set to kill. Hellar's Harbour is just gone, except for pieces of his legs, and they kind of fall over. Right. So, the shadow spells make you, hallucinate, or is it a hallucination or what? But you hear voices anyway, and then terrible destruction. You may actually remember Deliritous noted he'd seen Marla vaporize rats. I think he says vaporize, but definitely kill rats with shadow spells. So we kind of had some suggestions of how potent shadow could be here. And Baz is kind of horrified, right? Obviously he was trying to save Deliritous here, but he realizes he's killed someone, right? And it's like, geez, even Arrow seemed like a pretty bad dude. I probably did Oration a favor by killing him, but geez, should anyone have that much power to just speak some words and kill somebody? Again, this is actually, we're going to get to this in a few minutes talking about the next chapter, but this theme of, is power all it's cut out to be, comes up here, and I'm going to save a discussion of that for a few minutes in the future here of this episode, but, keep that in mind. Baz certainly isn't excited about killing somebody here. Kind of tosses the book aside after he reads the spell. And I guess we see kind of a third justification, too, for shadow being a little understood element. Deliritous, again, Deliritous helps out Baz here, right? He doesn't just say, oh, but it's Baz, I guess that's because And even Deliritous can tell, if he gives away Baz, well, okay, they'll just kill him too and still leave Deliritous out here with a broken leg. But Deliritous is like, no, it wasn't. It wasn't a spell. It was a dragon out there in the shadows. And Marla and Hellar actually, they take this at face value. They don't think he's lying. So that would seem to suggest that the spell that Baz cast isn't one that you see very often, right? It's plausible that might have actually come from a dragon. And Marla says, oh, well, it must be a shadow breather. That was a shadow spell. So that's interesting. Shadow breathers kind of seem, she doesn't give much explanation here, but they live between this world and the elsewhere beyond, right? So almost like a ghost, so even the fact that they can't see a dragon now doesn't necessarily mean it wasn't out there. And we heard reference to fire breathers earlier, right? So there's at least 2 types of dragons in this world. Maybe we've got more. Fire and shadow are 2 of the 5 elements. Maybe we have dragons for the other 3 as well. So we'll have to keep an eye out for those as well, like my dragons. So Marla and Hellar run away, and they leave Deliritous with his broken leg and Rock's trapped. And, luckily they think they're just leaving him there to die, but of course Baz is still there, unknown to them. He waits until they're gone, then he goes over to Deliritous. And what does Deliritous do? He yells for Baz to stay away from him. Baz, a cow chewing on cud. That's the name of the final section we've got here. And Baz is incredulous, at least initially, right? He just saved Deliritous, and that's how Deliritous is going to treat him here. He keeps going on. Deliritous keeps going on about how Baz, well, we're going to have to bring you back to Erstwhile and get you blinded like your brother now. And Baz slaps him across the face, right? Kind of an interesting reversal of roles here. And when it actually hits Baz, kind of makes him sick, right? Because Baz threatens to hit Deliritous again, and Deliritous kind of cowers away, right? What does he say? Oh, I never hit you. And geez, I don't know, but this is a pretty powerful moment to me. I think, Baz kind of realizes, the instant he gets a little taste of the power that the readers generally have over the speakers, he begins using it to abuse Deliritous, kind of acting like a reader. Gain an ounce of power, and look what his first inclination had been. Treat Deliritous just like most readers treated their speakers. As I was noting just a minute ago, kind of an interesting and maybe startling idea here. It's not always easy to do the right thing when you're the one in a superior position. And Baz perhaps grasps in this moment that having power isn't all it's cracked up to be, with the temptations that it presents. Kind of another theme we're going to see here again and again throughout the series. Power isn't always necessarily a good thing. And Baz realized, after this, Baz kind of comes down from his kind of frantic high, kind of realizes that maybe his brother was right about Deliritous. He's just a product of his environment, and you can't entirely blame him for that. Not that I'm trying to justify Deliritous' participation in this slave society, but then again, this is all he's ever known. He was born into this set society, and Baz notes that a lot of slaves in his position they'd probably just run away, right, and run to freedom, or at least try to find freedom. Maybe they would even cut Deliritous' throat before they did that. But but doing that would be like killing a cow for chewing cud. It's just what they do. Baz isn't going to do that. And once again, Baz also realizes that his only chance of ever seeing Tax again, his brother, is to work with Deliritous now. He can't go back to Erstwhile if he runs away. He needs Deliritous to get back there, so killing him or running away is not an option. So Baz comes up with a plan. What if he travels to Tome and finishes the trials for Deliritous? Dum, dum, dum! Oh, man. So we kind of end on a cliffhanger here this week. What is Deliritous going to say to that? And you'll have to tune in next week for Chapter 13 to find out about that. Just a couple other quick things here to note about Chapter 12. Deliritous at one point, he's kind of like resisting making this admission that Baz helped him out, and then, Rox kind of chimes in here. Truth. Rox understands. They'd be dead without Baz. So again, at this point, Rox has actually demonstrated far more good qualities than bad ones. So, good old Rox here, like I said a few chapters back, he's turned into he's got a teddy bear with a sword in his hands, right? Rox can mess stuff up, but he's not a bad guy, it seems. And Deliritous also notes that he has nightmares about what he did to Tax, and obviously again he feels bad about it, even if Baz doesn't want to hear about it. So just another couple quick notes there, and that's it for our discussion here. So like I said, next week we're going to read Chapter 13, Baz and Deliritous. We see this plan that Baz has come up with fleshed out a little more, and then we get to a town. And in this town, there is a big moment, a reveal of epic proportions, very relevant to this podcast, particularly for those of you who watch on YouTube. You can't really miss the moment, but keep an eye out and, jump out of your seat when it comes, right? Point at the screen, our Leonardo DiCaprio meme from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'm just smiling, picturing some of you doing that when you see the moment I'm talking about here. All right. Let's see. Our quest for this week. I need to get like the yellow question mark, put it above my head for this portion, like we have in World of Warcraft with the quest givers. Any thoughts out there on why shadow is dangerous? There was a subtle hint somewhere in the book about why that might be. So interested to see if anyone picked up on that. Shoot me your answers. DTKane at dtkane.com. We're probably not going to discuss, even if some folks guess this right, or not guess, but just get it right. Probably won't discuss this for a while. Don't want to give too many spoilers here, but if you think you know, shoot me an email. All right, and we will close with our quote here. This one comes from Mr. Martin from A Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin. Bran thought about it. Can a man still be brave if he's afraid? That is the only time a man can be brave, his father told him. I think we see a fair bit of bravery here out of Baz in this chapter, so I thought this was a good quote for this week. I like this idea. I think this comes up again and again in my writing too, of bravery being, bravery isn't the absence of fear, right? It's kind of being able to do the right thing or keep your cool in the presence of fear. And I think that's important to keep in mind. Brave people still feel fear. They can, they just don't let it, ruin their actions, so to speak. So there you go. Hope you enjoyed the episode today. And I'm looking forward to being with you all next week to read and discuss Chapter 13 of the Acktus Trials. So until next time, this has been D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. Future Dan, this is Chapter 11-5. 5. All right, we are moving on. All right, Chapter 12. What were they to do? Deliritous had spent his entire life learning it was a mortal sin. Damn it. God darn it. All right, let's see. What were they to do? Thanks for listening to D.T. Kane's Epic Fantasy Book Club. If you liked today's episode, please consider rating and reviewing wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and hit that subscribe button and the bell so you get notified whenever new episodes become available. If you'd like to listen to back episodes or review the show notes, visit dtkane.com/podcast. D.T. Kane's novels are available for purchase at most major online retailers, or you can purchase directly from his website at www.dtkane.com/books. You can receive a free short story and sign up for D.T. Kane's mailing list at dtkane.com/email-signup. If you'd like to connect, you can find D.T. Kane on Facebook at D.T. Kane Author or Twitter at D.T. Kane Author, or send D.T. Kane an email at dtkane@dtkane.com. See you next week.